This lesson probably needs no introduction, but our story begins on the third day following what we now call Good Friday, when Jesus Christ, the only perfect man who ever lived, the only begotten Son of God, was brutally murdered and laid in a grave. That was on Friday. On Saturday, he was still in the grave. He was dead, still dead, just as dead as anybody had ever been dead. Wasn't a special kind of dead, he was dead. He had ceased to live.
Come on.
But then Sunday came, and that's what we're reading about this morning. Mark chapter 16 verse 1 says, "When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him." Talking about Jesus. "And very early in the morning, the first day of the week, they came unto the sepulchre at the rising of the sun." Now the sepulchre was a tomb. It was a cave that had been hollowed out of a rock. And this was a way people were buried in those days. And according to the customs of the time, Jesus was Jewish and all of his followers were Jewish. And the way folks dealt with dead people is the day after they had died, they would go and anoint their body with spices and ointments because they didn't believe in embalming like we do today. But they were unable to do this to Jesus. See, he had died on Friday, which, according to Jewish custom, was the beginning. When it was sundown on Friday, that was the beginning of Sabbath. And according to the law of Moses, you weren't allowed to do any work at all on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to cook, you weren't allowed to clean, you weren't allowed to do anything. You weren't allowed to travel. You weren't even allowed to light a candle in your home. You were to be completely idle and think on God. So they were not allowed, according to their law, on that second day after Jesus had died, they were not allowed to go and anoint him, to carry out the ritual that they were supposed to carry out. But when Sunday came, the Sabbath was over, and they were determined to do right by Jesus. They were, in spite of, think about this. The people that killed Jesus were still on the lookout for his followers. They knew that the people who were against Jesus, the religious establishment of the time, the ones who had convinced Pilate to put Jesus to death, they knew that Jesus wasn't the only one that was carrying this message. They knew there were a whole bunch of people who followed him around and followed his words, and they were on the lookout for those people too. So despite this fact, despite that they were wanted by the law, these women were determined to get out and do right by Jesus, their friend. So they came very early in the morning. And they came to the sepulchre, said at the rising of the sun. That means they reached the tomb at the rising of the sun. That means they left home when it was still dark. And they said among themselves, "Who shall roll away the stone from the door of the sepulchre?" See, when Jesus had been put in that tomb, there was a great big rock that had been rolled in front of it as a way to seal it. This wasn't something that was special for Jesus. This is what they did. You can see it when Jesus, you can read about it in the book of John, when he raised Lazarus from the dead. He had to tell him before he could command Lazarus to come forth, he had to command him to roll the stone away. When you have a tomb that's carved into a side of a mountain, you have to have a way to seal it because dead people stink, and you don't want a bunch of dead people stinking up the joint, so you got to find a way to seal it off. So they had rolled a stone in front of this tomb of Jesus because they assumed that, like everybody else who'd ever died before him, he was going to decompose too, and he was going to stink too. And this stone, the way they constructed it in those days, you can picture a hillside, and they had dug into the hillside, and they had a big rock, and they had to have a good way to get the big rock in front of it, so they would dig kind of a groove out in front of the doorway, so when they pushed the rock, it would just kind of naturally settle into that groove. And then that way it also kept it from moving around. It was firmly seated in this groove. So these women, they not only had to figure out a way to, they were just 3 women and this was a big rock. They not only had to figure out a way to move a giant rock, but they literally had to figure out a way to push a rock up a hill. And they were wondering in themselves what they were going to do when they got to the tomb faced with this big rock. They knew it would be a challenge, but I think it speaks to their level of dedication that they went anyway.
Amen.
They went to the tomb anyway, knowing the challenge that was before them, they went anyway. As they made their way, either because of the dim light, they left before the sun was up, or because maybe they just couldn't see the tomb from where they were at, it was not until they came right up on it that they made a startling realization. When they looked, verse 4 says, they saw that the stone was rolled away, for it was very great. And you can imagine the relief that they must have felt. Here we had worried what we were going to do, how we were going to get in there to him, how we were going to access his body to perform this ritual, and thankfully someone has rolled it away for us. They must have been so relieved and amazed. But then something even more amazing happened. It said, entering into the sepulchre, they walked up to it and walked inside it. They saw a young man sitting on the right side, clothed in a long white garment, and they were afraid. They were afraid. And he saith unto them, Be not afraid, be not afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, which was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. Behold the place where they laid him. But go your way, tell his disciples and Peter that he goeth before you into Galilee. There shall ye see him, as he said unto you. And they went out quickly and fled from the sepulchre, for they trembled and were amazed. Neither said they anything to any man, for they were afraid. They thought it was a big deal that the stone had been rolled away, but when they looked inside, they realized something even more amazing. I want to tell you something that had never occurred to me. Jesus didn't need the stone to be rolled away.
No.
Jesus didn't need the stone to be rolled away. You can see in the days following his resurrection, when Jesus wanted to be somewhere, he just showed up.
You're right.
When his disciples were in the upper room, and they were locked in there because they were scared of the authorities, they were scared of people coming to get them. They had it all, you can imagine, they just had every deadbolt and lock. They probably had some furniture shoved up against the door, had it firmly sealed. And you know what? When Jesus wanted to get in there to them, he just walked through the door. He walked through a closed door. So Jesus didn't need the stone to be rolled away, to be resurrected. It's not like God raised him from the dead and then he was trapped inside this tomb. No, he didn't need that. So if Jesus didn't need the stone to be rolled away, why roll away the stone?
Come on, Zack.
The stone was rolled away for us.
Amen.
To see the empty tomb. To witness what the angel had proclaimed to those women. To see the grave clothes that he once wore. To see the napkin that was over his face. To feel the significance of his absence. Because let me tell you, people back then knew just as well as we do today that when somebody died, they did not come back to life. They had seen it time and time again. They didn't have anything like the medical care that we have now. People died a lot in those days, and they knew when somebody died, that was it. But not this time. The angels rolled the stone away so Jesus' followers could see that he was gone.
You're right, Zack.
But here's another question. If Jesus didn't need the stone rolled away, if the stone was just rolled away for us, why did God have to have the angels do it? He could have very well left it for the women to do. Surely at some point somebody would have rolled the stone away anyway just to prove that Jesus was a liar. Because he had told them that he would come back in 3 days. Surely at some point somebody would get the notion to go out there and roll that stone away and say, look, he's still there. So eventually somebody would have discovered that Jesus was risen. Why roll the stone away for the women? I'll tell you why. Because time and time again in the Bible, you can find that God is not concerned with your ability. God is concerned with your intention. God is not concerned with what you can do. He's concerned with what you're willing to do.
Amen.
You're right.
God knew that the hearts of those women were to go and to roll that stone away. And He knew as well as they did that they were too weak to do it. And He knew that they were going to try anyway, so He just went ahead and did it for them.
Come on, Zach.
If you have your Bibles, I want you to turn to Romans chapter 5. Those women are a lot like us, if you think about it. Every man, woman, boy, and girl knows exactly what is expected of them. They know exactly what we have to do. In those women's case, they knew that they had to go and they had to roll that stone away and anoint the body of their friend. And how much more blessed were they when they realized that their friend was gone and the stone was rolled away. But this morning, we all know what we have to do too. And we know that we are not strong enough. We know that we are not equipped to do what we have to do. We know what God expects of us. We know the kind of lives that God expects us to live. We don't have to talk about how wrong the way some people live is. You know within yourself whether you are doing right or doing wrong.
Amen.
Come on, Zach.
And you also know that no matter how much you try to do what's right, every time you try to do what's right, it ain't, but you have to turn around and you've already messed it up.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if I'm speaking for anybody else, but that's certainly how my life works. I try to be good to people. I try to live a life with love in my heart. And I try to treat people good, and I try not to lie, and I try not to I try not to sin. But every time I try, I fail.
Come on, Zach. You're right.
But just like those women, you just have to show up and God will do the rest.
You're right, Zach.
Chapter 5 says, therefore being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand, and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. And not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience. And patience, experience, and experience, hope.
Yeah.
See, hope is all that those women had. They knew what the facts were. They knew what common sense told them. They knew that Jesus, by all accounts, by all knowledge of this world, was still going to be there when they got there. They knew by all accounts, by every bit of common sense they had, they knew that when they got there, the stone would still be there. But they had hope. Verse 5 says, hope maketh not ashamed. If you have hope, hope won't make you ashamed.
Come on, Zach.
If you have hope, hope won't embarrass you.
Amen.
Because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, which is given us. And this is what I want to get this morning. For when we were yet without strength. What did those women lack that morning?
Strength.
They lacked strength. They knew that the burden that they had to bear was too great. They knew that they were too weak to do what they wanted, what they needed to do. But Romans chapter 5 and verse 6 said, for when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. You can read the Bible. You can read the Old Testament and the New Testament. And as you go through, you see the requirements that God has placed upon man if they want to see.
Come on, Zach.
You can read in the Old Testament about the law that God gave Moses. And you can read the hundreds of regulations that God expected for people to keep themselves clean and to keep themselves holy. You can read in the New Testament, Jesus boiled it all down to 2 commandments. He said, love God and love your neighbor. Well, seems like a much simpler version of things, but have you ever tried it?
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever tried to really love God and tried to really love your neighbor?
Come on, Zach.
I can't even keep the 2 commandments. But you know, that's exactly the situation that the man who wrote the book of Romans found himself in.
Yep.
For those of you that don't know, the book of Romans is a letter written by a man named Saul. And Saul was a very religious man. Saul was a man that from the time he was little studied at the feet of some of the greatest biblical teachers of his day. Saul knew the Word front and back. Saul knew exactly what God required of him.
Couldn't do it.
And time and again, Saul found that he could not live up to what God wanted. So Saul tried even harder. Saul devoted himself to constant study. Saul became a zealot for his religion. He even resorted to murder. He was so convinced in his religion, his Jewish religion, that he went about killing people that he thought were false teachers. He went about killing Christians because he felt that they were presenting a version of religion that was against what God had taught Saul. He was so entrenched in trying to live up to what God expected of him that it almost drove him crazy. But then you can read in the book of Acts, Saul was on his way one day and he met this man named Jesus, and he found that the stone had already been rolled away. Saul found that no matter what he had tried to do in himself, Jesus had already done it for him.
Bless you, Zach.
Saul, though he tried to live a perfect and upright life, failed time and time again. At one point in the Bible, he even identifies himself as the chiefest of sinners. The worst sinner of all sinners.
You're right, Zach.
When he met Jesus, he found out that Jesus lived a perfect life that he couldn't. And by believing in Jesus, Paul could be perfect too. Paul, of course, being the name that Jesus changed his name to from Saul. So that's what he's talking about when he says, for when we were yet without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. He goes on to say, for scarcely for a righteous man would one die.
Help him, Lord.
I'll paraphrase. Paul says, you wouldn't find hardly anybody that would die for a righteous man. If you ask somebody to die for a righteous man, you might be able to find somebody. He says, maybe you could find somebody that would dare to die for a good man. In verse 8 he says, God commended His love toward us. Because we were worthy of it? No. In that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us.
Yes, Zach.
God is not concerned with your ability. He's concerned with your availability. He's not concerned with your strength. He's not concerned with your moral goodness. He's not concerned with how much you want to give in the offering plate. He's not concerned with how you serve the poor. He's not concerned with how much time you give to working around the church or feeding people. He's not concerned with any of your abilities. He's concerned with your availability.
Come on, Zach.
Just like those women in the garden that morning, they had the intention. They had the desire. And when they got there, they found the burden was already lifted. All you have to do is come, and you'll find that the work has already been
Come
done.
on, Zach. Amen.
The rock has already been rolled away.
Bless you, buddy.
Yes.
Jesus is out of the tomb, and He's ready to meet you.
Yes.
That's my lesson this morning. Thank you.
Good job.
Bless you, Zach.